Welcome to Zero. I am Akshat Rathi. This week, how to avoid blackouts. We take electricity for granted. And when it disappears, even briefly, we struggle to do simple things in life, like taking an elevator or crossing the road without a red light. Now imagine a countrywide blackout, not for minutes, but for nearly a full day. That's what happened in Spain earlier this year.
There was no music, there wasn't, no TVs were on, and people were just on their balconies or outside talking and just spending a spring night under the lights of the candles.
That's my colleague Laura Millan. And while her experience of the blackout sounds like something straight out of a rom-com, that moment was an exception. Because for almost a full day, Spain was in chaos. And it sparked a huge conversation. In the last 5 years, Spain has tripled the amount of solar it has deployed on the grid. Because, of course, it is now the cheapest source of electricity. And Spain's story is not unique. Solar is being deployed in huge amounts nearly everywhere. That's also why people wanted to know, was solar to blame for this blackout? And if it was, what needs to be done to make modern grids stable when intermittent renewables are taking up a growing share of the energy mix? Today we are going to look at that question and our reporting trying to answer it. To tell that story, I'm joined by my Bloomberg Green colleague Laura Millan, who's based in Madrid. We'll look at the lessons from the Spanish blackout, get nerdy about the solutions that are already available, and hear what places like the UK and Australia that have huge amounts of renewables already are doing to stabilize the grid. This is the fourth episode in the Bottlenecks Series, in which we look at the little-known things holding back electrification and clean energy. Check out the previous episodes in the show notes. Laura, welcome back to Zero.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So I want to start a few months ago, in April, with what happened in Spain. There was a nationwide blackout. It affected not just Spain, but also Portugal, some parts of France. And it kicked off this huge conversation about whether renewables are to blame. But before we get into the details, tell us about your experience, because you were in Madrid and you saw how it played out and you yourself were affected.
Yes, of course, as was everyone in the country and, like you said, in the region, actually. So I was at the office, I was working, and suddenly the lights went off. But because we have a backup generator in the office, the computers didn't. And we thought it was, some sort of issue with electricity supply in the building. So we just waited for a bit, but then we started hearing sirens outside. And when we looked out the window, we realized the street lights were off. And that's when we started thinking that something more serious was going on. So I started texting, and so did others in the office, family members and friends outside of Madrid, to figure out how widespread that was. And we started getting messages back from people all over Spain saying they didn't have electricity. And, within the first few minutes, we worked out that the lights were off across the country.
And how did the rest of the day play out?
The rest of the day was quite intense for us as journalists, because obviously it was all about trying to figure out what had happened and why and what the impacts were, without knowing how long the generator in the office would last. It actually ended up lasting the whole night, which was very useful for us. But it wasn't the case for, many people across the country. So people were trapped in trains and metro for hours. The electricity lights in cities weren't working, so there were huge queues of cars, of people trying to get back home. Shops didn't have power and had to close or remain open without electricity. So it was a tricky day. Fortunately, emergency services, hospitals, airports all had backup systems that worked. And we actually found out these sort of strategic places have backup systems that can last for days at a time. So thankfully, the blackout didn't last for that long, and except for some events and some people that obviously had to spend a lot of time stuck inside trains and metro wagons. Essentially, the rest of the country was okay. So obviously my main concern when the first few moments of stress and trying to figure out what was going on was trying to find out where my family were. In the end, I walked back home. It took me a bit longer than it should have. And I found that they were okay. Thankfully, we've got a small gas-powered barbecue. So we were able to eat dinner. And as the hours passed and it became dark, it was actually a pretty beautiful scene to watch from our home, the windows of our neighbors that were lit on candles, because that's what everyone was using, candles and flashlights. And then when the lights started to come back, they came back district by district. So from our window, we were able to see other buildings that started to be lit. And then light came to ours at just before midnight. So that was our little blackout adventure.
I'm glad you got a little moment of peace. Talk us through what we know happened and what we understand caused the blackout.
So what caused the blackout is still under investigation. There are 4 different investigations ongoing at the moment. One by the Spanish grid operator has already finished and they filed a report waiting for the definitive reports of the other investigations. We know some things failed. We know there were some outages in some solar farms in Spain south, and that destabilized the grid. But that had happened before and didn't lead to a nationwide blackout. So likely what happened is a chain of events that happened one after another, and the combination of all of these led to the blackout. But again, what we know happened is these solar farms disconnected themselves from the grid. They stopped providing power, and then the grid operator, which is in charge of maintaining grid stability and making sure the lights are on, requested backup stability services from the gas plants in Spain, and the gas plants weren't quick enough to get started. So because it took them about an hour and a half to go online, within that period of time between the moment that the grid operator requested their services and the moment when they actually could start running, that's when the blackout happened. What happened then was, because of this lack of stability, of this instability in the grid, other generation plants across the country detected that, and to avoid this instability filtering into their own networks, into their own systems, they disconnected themselves. And so within a matter of a second or less than that, the whole country went into the dark, as we know. And that's what the investigations have found so far. And then what they recommended as well, Spain's grid operator and then the European grid operator, which is also investigating and has released some initial conclusions, is that Spain needs more synchronous compensators and grid-forming inverters. So these are devices that can help the grid operator handle voltage instability like the one we had on April 28th. With more of these devices, the blackout wouldn't have happened. And so the next step for the Spanish grid is installing more of these devices. And this is where we teamed up, you and I, Akshat, because the solutions needed to deal with these blackouts are not new. That's when we started, you and I, having this conversation of not just what went wrong in Spain, but what can countries do to make sure that doesn't happen again. Akshat, you're in the UK, which had its own blackout in 2019. What happened after that?
Yeah, it's clearly not the first blackout of the renewables era, so to speak. The UK had one on August 9th, 2019. It was relatively small compared to what happened in Spain. About 1 million people are affected. Lights were back on in 45 minutes. But the event was big enough and worrying enough that the grid operator was forced to take immediate action. And one of the things that it did was create this program within months to provide grid stabilizing services. And synchronous compensators were among the first to try and provide these services so that they could help avoid these blackouts.
And can we step back just for 1 second? And can you explain to us what a synchronous compensator is and why does the grid need it and how it works, essentially?
Yeah, it is a really complicated thing. So let's take it step by step. The grid, as it has existed over the past 100 years, has run on spinning things. And that might not seem like something people realize because we never see those spinning things. Those are turbines that are powered by either coal that heats up water, produces steam, and then the steam turns the turbine, or it's a gas-powered turbine where the gas itself is being burned inside the turbine. And the spinning action is happening surrounded by magnets. And because of the interaction between the shaft that is spinning and the magnets, you get a production of electricity. Electricity that we get on the grid is alternating current. It sort of swings between plus and minus, and it does so at a very constant frequency, which is to say it swings between plus and minus about 50 times per second, or what grid people will call 50 hertz. For 100 years, grid operators have known how to manage electricity when there are these spinning devices on the grid. But now comes solar, which is the first form of electricity generation that has nothing that is moving. It's really just light from the sun falling on some silicon chips that releases a bunch of electrons, and you get electricity. And it is a form of electricity that the grid hasn't quite understood how to handle yet. And so in the short term, what the grid operators have thought they could do is, if you're not going to have coal or gas-powered turbines, you add something that is spinning but is not burning any fossil fuels. And that's what a synchronous compensator is. It really just is a device that consumes electricity, a small amount, all the time, and keeps this 100-ton object spinning all the time and providing these grid stability services.
And you actually went to see one of them in action, right? Can you tell us, what did it look like, this big, heavy machine, and what was it doing for the grid, specifically in the place where you want to see it?
So I got to see the very first one that was built in the UK following this blackout. It was built in Liverpool in the north of England, and it's situated between an abandoned market and this rusty old substation. But when I went to the site, it had this high fence that was electrically charged because it's a critical national infrastructure, so it needs to be protected. Before we got in, we had to put on ear protection because I was told they are very loud and that we won't be able to have a conversation inside. So the first thing that you see when you go inside is this big object that's behind a metal shield, and it's very loud. And the second thing that happens is you smell oil. That oil is necessary to help this 98-ton object to spin at 1,500 rotations per minute constantly.
So that's so interesting that the object that you're talking about that performs this very important function for the grid and to keep the lights of a country on is somewhere that, probably you could walk through there or next to there and not even notice. Did they tell you how often, because obviously the synchronous compensator is turning all the time, but how often does it really kick into action and provide this much needed stability service to the grid? Do you know?
So it actually kicks in every few days. And that is to say, every few days, the grid in Liverpool is experiencing something like what Spain experienced, which is either a solar farm going down or an interconnector, say from Norway, which is bringing in 1 gigawatt of power, just suddenly stopping. And this device, the synchronous compensator, basically pumps in extra power when needed, and it reacts within 1 millisecond of such a fault happening. Or if there is an extra injection of power because a power plant is malfunctioning, then it absorbs that power. And it does that automatically. It's not like some person has to decide. It is reacting to the variations in the grid and making sure that the grid's frequency, which is 50 hertz, stays constant by either injecting power when needed or absorbing power when needed. And you can actually measure that change because the rotational speed, so if it's moving at 1500 RPM, it might either move a little too fast or a little too slow when it is in action doing this work for the grid. More from my conversation with Laura Millan on the Spanish blackout and the technologies needed to solve it after this short break. If you're finding this episode insightful, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Recently, a listener who goes by Them Changes First said, listen to several episodes of Zero and you will get a sense of both how much there is to do on climate and how much progress we've made. Thank you, Them Changes First.
Akshat, you've just told us how the grid has run on spinning things for more than a century. But actually now we are seeing coal plants being decommissioned and even gas plants. And in the Spanish case, we saw how gas plants weren't fast enough to come online to prevent the blackout. So these are being replaced with synchronous compensators in some places. But my question is, will we remain stuck with the spinning things to make the grid work? Or is there something else?
Yeah, in our reporting, we found that grid operators are comfortable with spinning things. That's why if a gas turbine or a coal power plant is being shut down, or even a nuclear power plant, as we know happened in Germany, they are first being replaced by these synchronous compensators because it's sort of a like-to-like replacement for the grid operator. But we also know that the future doesn't have to involve spinning things. There are these grid-forming inverters that are available right now and deployed in some places that could do that job too.
So can you tell us what a grid-forming inverter is and how it works?
So inverters are something that have existed in the renewable era from the very beginning because solar plants and batteries produce electricity as direct current. And before they can be put on the grid, they need to be turned into alternating current. But the inverters that exist on most of these plants today are passive inverters. They basically copy the signal that is already on the grid. So if the grid is running at 49.5 hertz, the inverter will produce alternating current at 49.5 hertz. That can be a problem sometimes because if there is a fault on the grid, these inverters might amplify that fault and make things worse. And so there is a move to make these inverters smart by putting a computer processing chip in there and making them actually help the grid form the right frequency. So that's why they're called grid forming inverters. And what's being done these days is batteries are being linked up with these grid forming inverters, and they can do what these spinning devices are doing just in a digital manner. So the spinning devices produce something called inertia, which is when a thing is spinning, it keeps spinning because of Newton's laws of motion. And that is what is helping grid operators manage stabilizing the grid. What grid forming inverters are doing are essentially creating that signal with digital processing and making it be as good as what spinning devices could do.
I love that we are learning so many new and technical concepts in this podcast today. Akshat, how widespread is the use of these batteries, these grid-forming batteries?
Right now, synchronous compensators are cheaper to build, and so a lot of them are being deployed initially, but they are expensive to run because they're constantly consuming power. Batteries, on the other hand, are much more expensive upfront to build because batteries still are not that cheap, but they don't consume power all the time. The second problem with batteries is that because grid operators aren't yet comfortable with using batteries in this manner, they're only starting to be deployed in small ways in some places. So Australia has a few examples. The UK is building a grid forming battery right now. There are few in the US, but it's not as widespread as we would like. We spoke to Felicia Aminoff of Bloomberg NEF, and she said that grid operators are not yet fully trusting of how they work on the grid, but once they do, we'll start to see more of them. Now, we talked about sort of the lessons from the UK's blackout, why these technical solutions like synchronous compensators and grid forming inverters could help. What is Spain planning to do as a result of its own blackout?
So Spain started working on, first of all, obviously finding out what had happened, but also how to make sure it never happens again, because obviously it was, even if it just lasted a few hours, it was quite an impressive and traumatic experience for the country to have zero electricity for several hours on a day. So what we saw on the aftermath of the blackout, on the immediate hours and days after, was the Spanish grid operator going back to what it know it works. And so we actually saw less renewable power on the grid and more gas on the first few days. And then that gradually recovered. So renewable power going up, gas going down on the weeks after. And then on June 19, the Spanish regulator CNMC approved a revision of the rules aimed at keeping the voltage on the grid stable. Those rules had been stalled for months and even years. It just took so long for the regulator to approve them. But as soon as the blackout happened, it looks like for some reason the regulator thought that that was a good moment to approve them and make them kick in. So the new rules open what's called a stability market that was previously accessible only to gas and nuclear power operators. That's a market mechanism that encourages those in it to set up mechanisms, install devices to provide stability to the market. So again, before only gas and nuclear power plants were able to access that, and now wind and solar power plants will also be allowed into this stability market. So that step will encourage renewable operators to install devices like grid-forming inverters, like synchronous compensators that will provide stability to the grid because they will get paid for it, whereas before they weren't, so they didn't have any motivation to do it.
We are seeing now renewables deployment just grow rapidly. There is an IEA report that came out recently that looked at the share of wind and solar in the global grid mix. And between 2016 and now, in a period of 10 years, it has gone up from 4% to 20%. And it's showing no signs of stopping. We know that in the UK, after this blackout, with the addition of grid forming inverters and synchronous compensators, the amount of renewables on the grid kept rising. The same thing happened in Australia, where there was a blackout in 2016 in a place where wind power was growing very rapidly. They followed similar steps, and now Australia has a lot more wind and solar on its grid. So are we seeing countries around the world recognize the need for these grid stabilizing technologies, and are they investing in it?
Unfortunately not. As you were just mentioning, what we are seeing is countries reacting after a major event, a major blackout happens. So what we know from research by Bloomberg and EF is that investment in the grid is lagging in comparison to how much is being invested on adding renewables to the grid. So the 27 members of the European Union plus the UK invest on average $0.7 in grids for every dollar spent on renewables. Spain spent just $0.3 for every dollar in the grid, and that's the lowest among the countries that Bloomberg and EF was tracking. And it's not just Spain. There are blackouts everywhere in the world, and they are causing political backlash against renewable. And that's something that politicians can't afford right now if they want to fulfill their climate and their renewable commitments. So that's something that Antonio Guterres, the head of the United Nations himself, recognized in a speech in July, where he asked countries to really focus on grid investments and in grid infrastructure, saying that the ratio that we were mentioning before, the ratio between renewable investment and investment in the grid, should be 1-to-1.
Well, it's kind of interesting when the head of the United Nations is talking about investments in the grid in a speech. Like, clearly this is a big issue that needs to be handled. And of course, renewables are needed for meeting climate goals, but they are also increasingly, especially in developing countries, needed just to be able to keep the cost of energy low, because we know these are the cheapest sources of electricity that can be built. Is it just investments that are lacking, or are there other obstacles that are holding back countries like Spain from actually deploying these technologies?
Investments and money are not the only bottlenecks, actually. The main bottlenecks are regulation and the time it takes for each one of these machines, the synchronous compensators and even the grid-forming inverters, to be bought and installed into the grid. So, for example, the EU, the whole of the EU, operates under rules that were approved in 2012. So that's more than 10 years old. And they have been working, EU institutions, on an upgrade to the electricity network code for the past 2 years, but there's no clue on when that will become effective. So this upgrade would, in theory, theory, provide a framework for countries to then set up their own stability markets, a necessary step toward, again, encouraging companies to install devices like Spain has done now, devices like synchronous compensators and grid-forming batteries. More regulation is needed in Spain to keep evolving, to continue encouraging companies and setting up these markets and this framework. But what we have seen actually is that earlier in the summer, a decree with additional measures stalled in Congress. What's happening has nothing to do with grid stability, but the ruling Socialist Party is in minority in Congress, so it needs to agree with other parties to pass any regulations at all. And once the regulation is sorted, as we have seen in the EU and Spain, that's not a quick or easy thing. Then starts the moment of drawing up the contracts and setting the specifications, the technical specifications for the machinery, whether it's a synchronous compensator or a grid-forming battery. So we spoke to someone at Siemens Energy that told us that in Germany, these documents can be as long as 2,000 pages, and it can take up to 10 years to put them together and then set up the tender and for companies to respond to that and a winner to be declared. So it's a very long process, even when the regulations are in.
The Siemens Energy expert was also telling us it's not like all countries do this. The UK does have leaner regulations and can get synchronous compensators on the grid pretty quickly. The Liverpool tender was won and the device was working within 18 months of it happening. So there are clearly lots of lessons that countries can learn from each other. Now, when we do this kind of reporting, we are spending weeks and months talking to experts, going to places, looking at these devices. But editors want this story to reach a big audience. And one of the frames that our editor, Aaron Rutkoff, was very keen on us hitting in the story was that, is there a kind of a hangover that comes from deploying so much solar? Because it's cheap, because it meets not just renewables goals, but also lowers the cost of power on the grid. Are they going on a sugar rush or an alcohol binge, just deploying lots and lots of solar, but not realizing what might be the outcomes? What do you conclude having done this work?
I think it's a good metaphor. We know how these countries have set up first very ambitious renewables targets. So the EU has a clean energy target of at least 42% by 2030, while Spain has an even more ambitious target of 81% by the end of this decade. Then we saw how the cost of renewables went down and they became the perfect solution to provide cheap energy at a time when there was a cost of living crisis. So obviously that was the perfect solution, but they just forgot the very important thing that the grid does, which is connect the places where the power is produced with the places where the power is consumed. And that's when the hangover comes in form of a terrible blackout that leaves a whole country, 2 countries actually, without power for hours. And people suddenly asking about devices that no one was concerned about before, synchronous compensators, grid-forming inverters. Suddenly everyone in Spain now, it's become part of the conversation. Why don't we have these things? That's our hangover.
Yes, this was a lot of fun to report. Quite a nerdy story, but such an important solution. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Akshat.
And thank you for listening to Zero. Now for the sound of the week. That is the sound of the synchronous compensator I went to see in Liverpool. Loud, huh? To read the full report on the Spanish blackout and the solutions to deal with it, head to Bloomberg.com or find a link in the show notes. If you like this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Share this episode with a friend or with someone who likes spinning things. This episode was produced by Oscar Boyle. Our theme music is composed by Wonderly. Special thanks to everyone involved in reporting this story. Haley Warren, Tom Fevrier, Will Mathis, Thomas Gualtieri, Emily Buzo, Aaron Rutkoff, Somnath Bhatt, and Jody Maxon. I'm Akshat Rathi, back soon.